Have you ever wondered what happens to an Amish woman the morning after her husband is buried, with no life insurance policy, no social security check, no pension, no government program, and a farm that cannot run itself, and who exactly shows up to make sure she survives? No insurance, pension, and government. An Amish widow has none of the financial safety nets that most Americans assume will catch them in a crisis. The Amish do not pay into Social Security, a religious exemption granted by Congress in the 1960s after Amish leaders petitioned for the right to care for their own rather than participate in a government program. They did not want. They do not carry life insurance or apply for government assistance. What an Amish widow has instead is something that cannot be purchased or canceled. She has a community committed to ensuring that no widow faces her situation alone, and that commitment arrives at her farm within the first week of her husband's burial. 10 teams of men at her farm. The response to a husband's death in an Amish community is immediate and practical. Within the first week, the community mobilizes to address the widow's most urgent needs. A community observer described what this looks like. On a single Saturday, teams of men arrived at the widow's farm not through a formal system, but because everyone understood what needed to be done. The men plowed the fields and prepared the farm for winter. They sealed the home and barn for the cold and brought supplies of coal and firewood for the months ahead. The women cooked and baked throughout the day, feeding the workers and bringing food for the widow. By the end of that Saturday, the farm had been prepared for the coming season and stocked with fuel and food. Nobody sent an invoice. The farm an Amish husband built does not go on the market when he dies. It does not pass to a bank or an estate that must be liquidated. In the Amish inheritance system, the farm typically passes to the sons, often the youngest, who is expected to remain on the property and care for aging parents or the son most capable of managing the farm. The widow does not lose her place there. She remains on the property while the son assumes responsibility for running the farm. Her needs are included in the arrangement from the beginning. She helped build the life that exists on that farm and raised the sons who now run it. The community recognizes that, and the inheritance structure reflects it. The Dawdy Haus. As the farm transitions to the next generation, the widow typically moves into the Dawdy Haus, the smaller dwelling found on many Amish farm properties for this purpose. The Pennsylvania German term Dawdy Haus translates literally as grandfather's house, reflecting its role as a residence for the older generation when the younger generation takes over the main farmhouse. The Dawdy Haus is not a nursing home or a separate property that forces the widow to leave her community or the farm that has been the center of her life. It is a smaller house on the same land close enough that she remains part of the daily life of the farm and family, with her grandchildren nearby and the son and daughter-in-law able to provide practical support as she ages. The arrangement keeps generations living close together, the older generation stepping back from management while remaining present, connected, and cared for by family and community. The Church Alms Fund. The financial safety net that replaces Social Security, life insurance, and government assistance in the Amish community is the Church Alms Fund, a pool of resources maintained by each congregation, managed by the deacon, and distributed to members facing genuine financial need. Every member of the congregation contributes to this fund. The contributions are not a fixed percentage. The deacon, who maintains personal knowledge of every family's financial situation, assesses what each household can reasonably give and what each household genuinely needs. The system is not anonymous. It is personal. The deacon who distributes funds to a widow knows her. He knows her farm, her children, her circumstances, and the specific nature of the financial gap created by her husband's death. His distribution decision is based on direct knowledge rather than on a form filled out for a bureaucratic review process. The widow who receives support from the Church Alms Fund is not receiving charity from strangers. She is receiving the pooled resources of a community that has known her for decades, resources that she and her husband contributed to throughout their marriage, that they never needed to draw on until now, and that the community is now directing toward her because her need is real, and her membership in the community that created the fund is the only qualification required. Her own income. An Amish widow is not financially passive, waiting for the community to provide everything she needs. She brings her own productive capacity to her situation, built across decades of the skilled handwork that is central to Amish women's economic contribution to their households. Quilting is the most significant of these skills for many Amish widows. An authentic Amish quilt, with its thousands of hand stitches, its complex patterns, and the hours of skilled labor it represents, commands significant prices in the English market. A widow who is an experienced quilter has a marketable skill that requires no storefront, no commute, no employer, and no compromise of the community's standards for what she should be doing with her time. She can produce quilts in her Dawdy Haus, sell them through the same channels her community has always used for selling handmade goods to English buyers, and generate income that supplements the community support and the farm arrangement without requiring her to leave her property or her community's way of life. Basket weaving, baking, canning, and other craft and food production skills serve the same function. A widow's lifetime of domestic productivity does not stop being economically valuable when her husband dies. It becomes the foundation of her independent income in the years that follow. The sons. The sons who take over the farm operation after their father's death have a specific and understood obligation to their widowed mother that is not written in a legal contract, but is enforced by community expectation and the Amish understanding of what family membership requires. Until the sons reach the age of 21, any income they earn, whether from farm work, from outside employment, or from any other source, goes into the family household rather than to their own personal accounts. This is the standard Amish practice for all unmarried children living at home. Their productive labor supports the household rather than their individual savings. For a widow with sons still at home, this means that the household's productive capacity does not collapse when the father dies. The sons are already functioning as contributors to the household economy, and that contribution continues under the widow's management until each son reaches adulthood, marries, and establishes his own household. For sons who are already adults when their father dies, the obligation takes a different form, the expectation that they will assume the farm's operational responsibilities, that they will include their mother's practical needs in the farm's economic planning, and that they will ensure she has what she requires as she ages. This expectation is not legally enforceable. It does not need to be. It is enforced by the community's observation of how sons treat their widowed mothers and by the understanding that how a man treats his mother is visible to everyone who knows him. The community workbees. The community's support for a widow does not end after the first week of mobilization. It continues across every season of the agricultural calendar for as long as the widow remains on the farm and the farm requires labor that she cannot provide alone. The workbees, the organized community labor gatherings that the Amish call frolics, are convened for the widow's farm at the same intervals they would be convened for any farm that requires community assistance. In spring, men arrive to plow and plant the fields that need to be worked before the growing season's window closes. In summer, the haying and the cultivation that keep the farm productive through the growing months are attended to by community hands. In autumn, the harvest frolic brings the community to the widow's farm to gather what the season has produced. The same priority given to an injured farmer's crops during harvest season applies equally to a widow's fields. In winter, the firewood and coal that the community brought in the first week are replenished as needed. These are not one-time acts of exceptional generosity organized around the acute grief of the first weeks. They are the ongoing expression of a community whose members understand that a widow's farm is a community responsibility for as long as she lives in it, not because she cannot eventually find other arrangements, but because the community's commitment to her did not expire when the first week's work was done. Remarriage. Remarriage after a spouse's death is common in the Amish community and is understood as both practically sensible and theologically acceptable. The death of a spouse ends the marriage covenant. The surviving partner is free to marry again, and the community recognizes this freedom without stigma or reservation. Researchers who have studied Amish remarriage describe two distinct types that reflect the different circumstances in which remarriage occurs. The first is what they call companion marriage, an older widow and widower, who come together primarily for companionship and mutual support in the later years of life, without the expectation of forming a new family or raising additional children. The second is family formation marriage, a younger widow, often with children still at home, who remarries a man who becomes a stepfather to her children and a co-manager of the household and farm. The courtship that precedes Amish remarriage is conducted with the same privacy that governs first courtships, sometimes even more privately, out of respect for the deceased spouse and the grief that the community is still processing. In some cases, the courtship is conducted entirely through letters exchanged by mail before the couple begins meeting in person. The community observes the developing relationship without formally organizing it. There is no matchmaking committee, no community approval process, no requirement that the widow wait a specific period before beginning to consider remarriage. The decision is hers, made within the community's understanding that remarriage is a practical and supported path forward for a woman whose husband has died. What she never has to do. The most revealing way to understand what the Amish widow's situation actually looks like is not to describe what she receives, but to describe what she never has, to do the tasks and decisions and navigations that a non-Amish widow in comparable circumstances would face, and that the Amish community structure removes from her path entirely. She never has to call a government agency to establish eligibility for survivor benefits, that the Amish exemption from Social Security means she was never entitled to receive anyway. She never has to sell the farm to cover debts or estate costs. The community's financial support and the son's assumption of operational responsibility prevent the financial collapse that forces property sales in other widowhood situations. She never has to grieve alone. The community that was present from the moment of her husband's death remains present in the weeks and months and years that follow. Not as a formal support program, but as the daily fabric of the community life she has always lived inside. She never has to find childcare for the children. Still at home, the extended family and community network that surrounds her household provides that support as naturally as it provides any other. She never has to explain her situation to a bureaucrat, fill out an application, or prove her eligibility for help that the community would give her regardless of any formal qualification. What the Amish widow never has to do is face the death of her husband as though it were a private problem with a personal solution. It is a community event. It receives a community response. It has always worked this way. It continues to work this way because the community has never decided that it should work any other way. The system described in this video, the 10 teams of men who arrive at the farm in the first week, the church alms fund that covers the financial gap, the sons who assume the farm's operation, the Dawdy Haus that keeps the widow on her own land, the workbees that continue every season without being requested, the quilting income that gives her productive independence, and the remarriage that is available to her whenever she chooses it was not designed by a government. It was not created by a social welfare organization. It was not funded by a tax. It was built by a community that made a specific theological decision about what membership in that community requires, that no member faces a major life crisis without the full practical and financial response of the people around them. And that the widow specifically is a person whose vulnerability the community has a direct obligation to address. The obligation comes from the community's reading of its own faith, James 1:27, which instructs that pure religion includes caring for widows in their distress. The Amish take this instruction literally. The community that surrounds the widow is the instrument through which the instruction is fulfilled. It does not require a bureaucracy. It does not require a monthly premium. It does not require an application.